Tony, you and I have never met before. This is actually a first time to chat, right? And
Yeah, that's
so
right.
the only what I know about you is that you're a friend of Brandon's and you're a former Ivy, I want to say HBA if you're a friend of Brandon's. So,
Yeah, exactly. We were the
okay.
same year.
Okay, great. Okay, so when I was teaching at Ivy, you were a student there, you just weren't one of mine. Um, Other than that, all Brandon told me is that you're an MBA, MPA, which I think probably means public affairs or public administration of some kind. Um,
Yeah,
so
you
you're
got it. Public administration.
so you're doing the dual degree. Okay. Tony, I've literally said everything that I know about you. So
Okay, sure.
one of the things that I'd be curious about is so you were an HBA. What was your first job after graduation? Because I don't even know that. And then kind of what took you on the path of now ending up where you are now?
Sure. I think well, first of all, the first job was McKinsey. So I was at McKinsey Toronto as a consultant for almost 4 years. Left as after about a year as engagement manager. And I think from there, what I wanted to do was I wanted to go from more arm's length consulting to be more of an operator and like to get closer to stakeholders and closer to projects and closer to like the impact that I really cared about. And I think the context there is that at McKinsey, I was also kind of searching for that. So I did most of my work in the like social impact space. And so post McKinsey, one, I just wanted, you know, maybe some structured, unstructured time to just think about what, um, or like how to create purpose through work and just through life in general. So I always wanted to go to school for that. But in the intervening about 1 year period, I went to do a chief of staff stint at an ed tech startup, and then also just like some independent consulting and sustainability. And so now I work in carbon removal, like climate tech. And that was like a pivot since coming to school. So a 2 year pivot so far, and it's been great.
Okay. Um,
Yeah.
Hearing that, uh, actually, I'm kind of curious. Is this something that you kind of already 85, 90% knew that you wanted to do even as an HBA? Or is this really a story of, in other words, there's a reason you must have chosen McKinsey, right? I don't know if that was intended to be a springboard to what you're getting into now, or if it's actually far more organic and unintentional than that, and it just kind of looks like that there might have been intention there.
I think I think it was much more organic than it's, described. I always feel like, people like overfit their stories where it's like, oh, I did X because of what, sorry, Y because of X and Z because of Y, and like there's like a very linear path. I feel like it never really is that. Like I also feel like there are a lot of like personal reasons why like I decided to go to McKinsey versus like at least Ivy HBA, I did the dual with Brandon. So I was also a software engineer. I did like my share of big tech internships. I also did investment banking internships. I was a little all over the map. And ultimately, it was like a personal reason why I wanted to stay in Toronto. And I felt like in Toronto, consulting was, a better springboard than I guess both software engineering and banking, where both of those industries like just didn't feel um, didn't feel like as well developed as like consulting for like a junior analyst or
Okay.
an engineer. Yeah.
I- Interesting. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm hearing this correctly, it sounds like actually the reason you chose consulting, it wasn't even about the consulting as your first priority, it was about location. So, So
Partially, yeah. Partially.
it was actually more about that. And then you started with, okay, now that I know I'm going to be in Toronto or have to be in Toronto. And then what I'm getting from what you're saying, Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, is that what you were picking was basically the widest springboard you could find, right? That would take you in a bunch of different directions or could if you wanted. Because what you didn't say, what you could have said is that I've always been fascinated by strategy consulting and the idea of going in and doing consulting projects for big Fortune 500 companies has always been a dream of mine, but I didn't hear these words. And so it doesn't mean that you didn't enjoy it or anything, but
Sure,
it
sure.
wasn't the motivation, it sounds like. Do I have that right?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. I think for me it was like a lot of um like wanted to be close to family and friends. And that
Okay.
was like especially important at that time, just given some like personal losses.
I see. Okay, so you
Yeah.
have that as kind of the dominant part of the narrative,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, I guess I'll go to McKinsey because people who go to
Well,
McKinsey have a lot.
I also, I mean, I don't want it to come off like that. Like McKinsey is like great and it was like a really great option, but I do think like um it would be an overfit of the story, I guess, to be like, I've
Yep.
always wanted to go to McKinsey because I don't, I just don't think that's true. That there was a lot of like soul searching, and multiple internships in multiple different spaces and recruiting every year. So,
Yeah. No, and I think that makes sense. I mean, Tony, when you went through recruiting at Ivy, I mean,
hmm
I was there a while, and I got to hear a lot of it from my at least
sure.
my students. You talked about soul searching? Do you feel like you had a lot of time and space to do that? Because a common complaint from a lot of Ivy HBAs is that they don't have that actually.
Hmm. Yeah. Wow, this is like I'm dating myself, but this is like so long ago now. I think like maybe the like rose-colored glasses view is that I did. I probably I probably only did because I was doing the dual degree. I just, love school apparently, dual degree twice. But because I was doing the dual degree with engineering, I got an extra summer and an extra year where everyone else was doing full-time recruiting. And I got to essentially spend like 2 semesters of my fourth year kind of a little unplugged from that world and like, applying to a bunch of different things. Just having a bunch of different conversations. Like I remember just like doing a bunch of like nonprofit interviews that year right after doing my investment banking summer. But I do think like for someone who's just doing like the 2 year Ivy HBA experience, no, there definitely wasn't. And like I know the timelines are accelerated now,
Yeah.
but even when I was an HBA one, it was essentially like I got in 2 weeks later, I was like applying to WIC, Western Investment Club. And then after getting into um, that role, I think it was like immediately starting interview prep. And so it wasn't like, oh, I'm considering banking or I'm considering consulting. It was like I just made a random decision to try to apply to WIC, and then it was like locked into banking and recruiting. And that was really it. And I got the job in like November, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna take it. And I didn't think about it for the rest of the year. Like that, it was just like I think people get locked in like right then and there. Like I was like 19 or no, sorry, 20. Like I got a US banking job that I couldn't even, drink at when I was there. Like it was so young, so early. Um yeah.
Yeah. This is a pretty common thing that I hear. MBA kind of works similarly. And actually, maybe because you're doing dual and you have a little bit more time, you're getting a bit more on your clock.
Sure, yeah.
But the clock is still there, right? I'm sure
I
you.
I I I didn't expect it to be. I think for me, maybe a little less. But for a lot of my peers, yes, like very much so.
Yeah. Yeah, that's also been a common complaint. Um, when you were going through the process, Tony, so obviously you ended at McKinsey, but it does seem like that extra summer bought you some time, as you said,
Hmm.
to explore a little bit. Because it sounds like you tried banking. It sounds like you tried, or you at least looked into other things um,
Yeah,
before settling on your on finally going to McKinsey. Do you feel like that? I'm going to phrase this as precisely as I can. Did you have a
sure.
conversation with anyone at the school who was trying to help you sort this out? Or how did you sort it out, I guess is my question.
I did not. Never. I felt like I had always, if you asked me, I would always say that Ivy had incredible career management resources,
Uh-huh.
but it isn't, what I'm saying isn't the school. It's like the fourth years, the second year HBAs were that career management resource. And so, but I think that's also very much because like I was recruiting for industries that are like very like traditional at IB, where like you can get a lot of this support. I, and I think like I definitely know friends who felt very frustrated, by this because they were, not even anything crazy, but they like wanted to do like product manager, but there really wasn't anyone, to do or to help with that or to help think through that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
A pretty common complaint. Looking back, do you feel like that if there had been, whether it's a person who would have sat down with you with more of a structure of like, hey, here's actually a whole set of things you could do instead of kind of pushing you 2 weeks into a club and then pushing you into an internship right away, that might have changed the choices you might have made, or do you feel like actually
Mm.
that everything kind of turned out exactly the way that it would have, even with, someone kind of coming in and adding more of guidance or help or whatever it is?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I would like to say yes, but I feel like the inertia of like the social inertia at these schools that's like pushing you to be, doing some of these like quote unquote prestigious recruiting funnels and the companies themselves coming like earlier and earlier and not really respecting, I think, the school's like, career management resources and like career timelines. Uh, I think probably would have been too much, but like I think like still helpful. Like I do think like when I just finished at Wharton, but like Wharton, I did end up speaking to, career management a decent number of times. And I think they were really helpful, maybe not so much as to exploration, but at least to like tactics. Um, Especially now because I'm like more making my own roles rather than like applying to roles. Um, so I think there's like value. But I think like when I was 20 or 19 or 20 and like 300 people out of 600 were applying to consulting and the other 200 were applying to banking and all the timelines were, you know, what they were. I'm just not sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, Tony, you're reminding me when I was visiting Wharton as a visiting professor, I remember there was an undergrad student who I met there who was affiliated with the institute I was working at. And like we just started chatting, and then she was going into banking, right? A big shock, right? Like a Wharton undergrad going into banking. Like natural question, like why, why that? Her answer was probably one of the most honest, straightforward answers I'd heard from any student. She said at Wharton, there's basically two, maybe three jobs, and then you basically pick one, right? And she
I
felt
feel the same way at Ivy, right?
right? And she was like, "Well, I don't want to do consulting, so I guess I'm going to do like it was just well, if that's what it is, right?" Which is, I've gone through it, right? I'm a business undergrad, and like banking was my first job, and then I did consulting too. So it's not like I have no idea what any of this is like experientially. But when you're a prof on the other side, this is not the most wonderful answer to kind of hear. If you care about students,
It's
do you
not
know what I mean?
inspiring. Yeah.
It's really not, right? So I guess one thing that I wonder, because everything that you're saying, Tony, echoes what so many other of my former students have said. What would you change about it if you could? Right? If you could, if we, you and I could sit down and basically sit down with a school like Ivy and say, all right,
Yeah, and clean sheet it.
let's do this differently because there's clearly some things that don't get addressed throughout and these are not small things, like what do you want to do with your life kind of things.
Hmm.
Um, what do you think we could do to change that if you and I had the power to?
And I think implied in power to change it, do you mean from the school side or like do you also mean from the industry side?
Let's say we had godlike power. I understand your question is is like how would we actually do it? I almost so this is a very impractical question, right? You and
Sure.
I can actually come
An
up. We're not going to be able to do
idealist,
it.
yeah,
There
an
are very
idealist
strong
world.
incentives in the bureaucracies that are going to work against us. So this will never actually happen unless there's something very, very dramatic that happens in education soon, which may or may not happen, but I'm not betting on it
Yeah,
happening
I
soon.
may or may not happen. Hard to
Yeah,
say.
hard to say, but let's free ourselves from any of the pragmatic issues here. Just we had godlike power, like we could actually just redesign the whole thing, and we could just get it done. What would you have loved to have been different, if anything, about the process that you went through?
I think if I think the foundational block to first go and tackle is is essentially this like culture of prestige, I feel like,
Hmm.
that like drives everyone into these two or three jobs. This perception that like I think at the time it was very much like, oh, like you're not smart or you're not capable if like you don't get, one of these offers from a leading firm. And like there were huge, I think, like social pressures. So I think like that like godlike power is like, okay, can we almost like not even starting at Ivy, but starting way, way before, like create a very almost like liberal artsy, like very high powered, K through 12 educational system that like doesn't leave people behind and creates like all of these pathways to like create interests, passions, and like connecting that to career and work. Like it's so nebulous in my mind, but I honestly believe that like it has to start like much earlier and it has to be this like comprehensive system to like shake us um from being this like one track mind of like what success looks like and like what does it mean to like create purpose in your work down the road. And that's like really hard, right? Especially for kids who are, just like interacting with each other all the time and like creating these social dynamics like immediately. And so I don't know. I think like I would start there and then I would have like, I don't know, like process changes just feel minor to me, right? Like if like companies can respect, all schools' recruiting timelines and you have like much more time and resources to connect students with, alumni of all different kinds down the road to like have these conversations and for students to really take that seriously. Like that's great. But I think like none of that will really happen even if you clean sheeted it if you don't go and address the like motivations. Um, I mean, if you want to explore that more, like let's do that here. But like that's my first instinct.
Is the K through 12 like actually redoing that part, you mean? Is that what you mean?
It's not even like redoing, but like I think it has to start early. And this is my like after McKinsey, I left to do like a pre-K startup. And also at McKinsey, I did a bunch of like K through 12 work. And I just like fundamentally believe that um like these things start young and like our educational system uh is one in which it always funnels and tracks you into things, like even in grade school, like applied or academic, you know, um, and it tracks you into like thinking, oh, like you have to be great at like, I don't know, math, science, CS, this kind of stuff to kind of succeed. And like, I don't know, shop, arts, humanities often kind of like fall to the wayside a little bit at most schools. And I think it's not like a teacher problem, right? It's like a resourcing problem and it's like a societal motivation problem. But anyways, that's kind of where I would start.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree. It's interesting. Like every time I ask this question in some way, shape, or form to a former student or someone like yourself, Tony, everyone has it's like everyone takes a different part of the chain, all of which is collectively part of the problem, right? And so, um, at least so far, I don't think I've heard someone bring up K through 12 yet, and I've been wondering when I would ever hear someone actually say this.
Okay.
And so I completely agree with you. Um, it's absolutely true that a lot of education is, let's be honest, prestige-based competitions, right? Or sort of these incentive systems based on competition where you get evaluated on, let's say, relatively narrow attributes of performance that may or may not correlate super well with life success, right? Like we can sort of debate about this, right? But
Yeah,
um,
or like joy and happiness.
right. Even that. So if we layer that on top, then we're really in trouble, right? Because I'm not sure that when you look at the data, if you use that as the metric, that the system is actually working beautifully well, right? So a more extreme version of a lot of what I'm thinking of, which exists in North America for sure, right? And particularly in the United States, but also in Canada, where you have any version of like an elite educational system, right? Where you have tiers. But in Asia, it's even more brutal, right? And sort of more upfront
Yeah.
and weighs even more heavily on things like a single day's exam or something like that, right?
Yeah, when my cousins went through the Chinese Gaokao, it's like one day it can change your life.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're sick that day, I mean, that's your life, right? So, and again, it's a set of very narrow tests, right, if you will, to that are supposed to be predictive of what is a way more complicated life than what the test would actually lead you to believe, right? And so it really breeds, I think, there are so many problems that come out of this. One is what you described. People just don't find what they want to do many times because like we joked earlier, in business school, if you think there's three jobs, well, okay, even if that were to optimistically cover 60% of the preferences of everybody in the crowd, the remaining 40% is just left to make do, right? And is pressured to kind of conform anyway, right? Which is a huge problem if you think about trying to maximize the joy, if you will, right, of the collective. So joy of the collective as you correctly point out, Tony, I totally agree with you, is it's clearly not what the system was designed to maximize, right? If you kind of look at it and study it, even if you kind of read the mission statements of high schools or kindergartens or these things, they have sort of very grandiose, very kind of romantic statements about what they go for. But if you look at what actually happens every day, it's totally not that. And as you say, I agree. It's not that individual teachers are often the buffer that actually still tries to fight for that when the system itself actually couldn't care at all about that kind of
Sure.
thing. So teachers are, but then everything hinges on whether you had good teachers or not, right?
Right.
Which the system should be helping that instead of being the sort of problem that the teacher then has to kind of do despite the system, right? Um, so so yeah, I think you and I think very much the same way. How would you how would you do it in principle, right? All right, so let's go through K through 12. Let's say you and I walk into, you pick high school, middle school, it doesn't matter. We know what it looks like now, right? You and I went through
Hmm.
that. What would you change about that?
Yeah. I knew that was like gonna be the next question, and I was like sitting here thinking about it. It's just so far beyond my expertise. It's like one of those things where it's like you have this godlike power and it's like just a monkey paw. And every time you try to change something, it probably like twists like your intentions into something like really, strange and absurd. Um, so I honestly like can't even like I can, but like like I resist trying to speculate because like I feel like a lot of this like should be done by someone with like a lot more expertise and like understanding of like children's development and things like that that I have like a like 50,000 foot like I think that probably um has an impact or I'm very convinced that it has an impact, but like how to go about it is like is so much beyond, me. But like I can like we can go and like speculate. I don't know if you've like done, a bunch of research or like read a bunch of stuff in the space, but
No, I'll admit to it. I'm not a education PhD. I mean, obviously, I do the job, and so I've like anybody on this side, and someone who's obviously gone through it, have a lot of kind of observations to reflect on in terms of, and obviously, I've got the business school version of it, which is, I think, maybe even more extreme than if I had been an English professor or something like this, right? Um, but I think, I mean, everything that you say and you observe matches kind of what I also feel like is an issue. I do get what you're saying about kind of the hesitancy to kind of suddenly say, well, let's make this policy change. Because you're right, the world is complicated and perverse stuff happens all the time when you do policy changes, particularly big
yeah, I feel
sweeping
like
ones. Totally
especially
understand.
as a policy major, I feel like education is so hard.
It is. Though what I will tell you as someone who's peripherally aware of stuff that's happening over there, you might be giving a little bit too much credit to the folks who are actually in it, and like what they're dealing with are things that are not kind of beyond your scope of understanding, right? And so we're not even at the point of trying to deal with the complexity, I think, of what you're talking about, right? Like people
Mm,
are still trying to kind of figure out simpler things like probably still not a debate anymore, but I'll give you an example. Like when I was in grad school, I had a guy who lived in my grad school dorm who was an education PhD at Berkeley. And they were still talking about class sizes, right? And trying to figure out
mm.
like like things that, we doesn't take a rocket scientist to kind of make some ideas about kind of what that might be. But that, if you think about kind of, is that going to be the biggest issue that we need to tackle when we talk about all these other things too? Maybe it's important, but there's certainly other things that they didn't even get to yet, right? Like they weren't talking about purpose, for example, at that time.
Right. Right.
Um,
I
so
mean,
you may know more than you think, at least in a relative sense. That's all I'm saying.
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Well, I guess like if we caveat everything I'm about to say is,
Sure.
this could just be random nonsense.
Sure.
Um, I think like and I've been in the US for a bit now, so maybe I'll like center it a little bit on the US system. But uh but I think like almost like the not like low hanging fruit, but like the biggest thing is that like schools are very unequally resourced,
Hmm.
and it's like all driven through and all almost entirely funded through property taxes.
Yeah. In the
I'm not
US.
actually sure if this is the same in Canada. I suspect it is not, or at least not to the same degree. Um, but even though I grew up with a Canadian education, I feel like because of my work, I've actually looked at the American education system a bit more than the Canadian one, which is a little embarrassing. But I think like because it is, so tied to property taxes and so uh, resourced unequally and such a NIMBY problem as well, where, communities don't want to, give up their property taxes to other communities. I think like the bare bones of like, oh, I'm gonna have enough space and time to, you know, find purpose as like as a teen, or 10-year-old is like my school is like well resourced and like has these options available. So I don't know. I think like
Hmm.
that's probably it's again, it's like a magic wave the wand thing that like probably will never happen. But I'd probably start there.
I
Um,
see.
and then, when the resourcing is less constrained, then you can start to think about um changes, I think, in not not curriculum, but maybe pedagogy, where where I do think like a lot of this like tracking and is like potentially unhelpful where like if you get put into like an applied class um or something it just becomes like uh really difficult to crawl or to jump back into a different path if you want to. And like and this is just like I don't even know if this will work, but I am partial to the like system of like competency based instead of grade based learning where like you're not like, oh, I got 70% on a test and I know 70% of the topic and therefore I can move on versus like there's like some set of things that are so fundamental that like you should do 100% and like before you can move on. But I'm not really sure how that would work. Another thing that I'm like a bit more partial to, I think that drives closer to the heart of this conversation is like the idea of like more kind of like interest-based projects rather than um it's like that can be self-driven and like with the help of, uh teacher support versus like, lecture-based, test-based pedagogy. But like those things, that's where like I don't really know. Like I feel like those are the kinds of things where like you may have to like test out and like would work so differently in different environments and different communities. Um, so I'm partial to them, but maybe as experiments to see like how they would work.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert on this at all, but this sounds a little bit like Montessori schools, if you're familiar with
I
that.
was in a Montessori school
Okay.
when
So,
I was in grade 7 and 8. Yeah,
okay.
it's really weird because I feel like everyone else was like in Montessori when they were like 6 years old and like or like 5 years old and then they went to like a public high school or something like sorry, public elementary school. But I was somehow put in a Montessori school for middle school. But still, I don't think at least my Montessori school still was relatively close, I think, to like the public school
Okay.
pedagogy and curriculum.
Got it. All right. So,
Relatively. Like there were differences, but like yeah.
okay, but they weren't just having you run free in the back and then,
No, at
you
least
were
not in maybe at the like preschool level, but
okay.
not like where I was. No.
Okay. I gotta admit, I never have attended a Montessori school, so I only know it conceptually, right? And so I have in my head this imagination that like kids just roam free or something like this, and I'm not really sure what happens.
It might be true. Maybe
I
mine was an exception.
yeah, yeah, I should probably look into that a little bit more before I comment at all about this. But yeah, no, I mean this is interesting. I mean, so Tony, you're correct me if I'm wrong. Earlier, you didn't say that you were interested in now going into education, though, right? You clearly do have feelings about education,
Yeah.
but you're going more
Yeah.
in the climate direction. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Partially I feel like the reason kind of came out through this conversation. I just think sometimes with education, it is so challenging to know like if because I'm kind of coming at it not from I'm not like a teacher and I'm not an administrator. Um, and so my role, at least in like a current stage of my career, I would love to, be like a math teacher maybe like later on in my life. Um, but that would require going back to school or like maybe private school, but like I don't know how I feel about that. But but I think like outside of like those direct with student or direct with school roles, um, my roles have often been like working business at like ed tech or like more like ed tech companies. And I think it's just incredibly challenging to know if like what you're doing at these companies is actually like, having an impact.
Hmm.
Because it's kind of like, and I'm sure many are, but the incentive to like, because a lot of these ideas are often not like academically super rigorous. And the people who are funding the academic rigorous are probably not the people that, that have like no vested interest. And and I also like kind of firmly believe that it's one of those things that is very different community to community. Um, and this idea of like a whole community approach to education has some like truth to me, where I think a lot of problems is like trying to scale up too quickly and not understanding like what made your school system or your school unique. So it felt like I was kind of constantly jumping through like cognitive dissonance, trying to figure out like what's good and what's bad. And I think uh and also like this is overfitting the story. Like what truly happened was also like I did this like chief of staff role at like a great ed tech startup called Brightwheel. But the CEO and I just didn't really see eye to eye. Um, and that's nothing to do with the business. It was just like a bad fit, I think. So I left and I did some like independent work with just so happened to be like sustainability startup. And I thought that was like really, really cool. And that was the last experience I had before school, and I wanted to explore more of it during school. And there just happened to be a great group of people and, some cool classes at both schools, both my MBA, MPA program in in climate. And so I just went and did more climate work. And there just wasn't, education focused classes at Wharton. And so like there's like the overfitted story and then there's like what happened and the truth is like somewhere in the middle.
Hmm.
But like both of those feel true to me.
Right. Now I appreciate you giving the honest, kind of balanced explanation. I mean, I'll be candid and say, as a guy who works in education, a very short version of half of your story is, yeah, I was really passionate about education. I cared a lot about it, but then once I got into it, the thing is so messy and hard. I decided I would go deal with another of the world's problems, right? Which in this case, and because solving the climate problem is easier than the education problem, right? That would be one interpretation, I think, of what you've said.
I think it's not so much that solving the climate problem is easier, but that exploring all different pathways to solving the climate problem is helpful, even if some of the pathways don't end up mattering in the overall like net zero picture. However, it's not like you can do that with like, you know, children's education. You can't be like, I'm gonna throw and try everything, and some of it's gonna, potentially harm or reduce educational outcomes and some of it's going to do good. Like that's not the same. Like that's where I think there's like a difference.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I get that perspective. I mean, there are people like in education who will still try to run experiments, though, right, on kids and class
Yes, yes,
because they
completely,
are trying to
completely.
figure out, what works. Um, but I do get that, right?
Yeah.
But
I also
yeah.
think like climate, when it comes down to it, will become more of like an economics and industrial problem rather than this whole like socioeconomic community um community impacted one.
What do you mean when you say this, Tony? I think I know what you mean, but what do you mean?
I think what I mean is like um the climate problem at not like all of it, but like the vast like a big chunk of it will come down to like can we scale industrial technologies? Can we make it affordable enough that like people want to switch? Plus like policy drivers versus like that's not solely the case with education where it's not like about getting to some like dollar threshold
Yeah.
or scaling, just purely scaling up a model in an economic way that will like go and, solve the problem or at
Okay.
least the vast majority of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's where I thought you were going with that. Yeah, you're right. I mean, in some sense, it's so much easier to figure out kind of economic growth and efficiency and trade-offs, right? And how you optimize that than, I mean, how do you measure joy of the collective, right? Like
Hmm.
how do you, I mean, we don't even measure that truthfully, right? When you think about kind of societal advancement, like it's gross domestic product is the primary measure we tend to use, which totally doesn't measure, right? Like how happy people are on a regular basis. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah. So when you don't even have the good measure, and it's hard to do, right? And
Hmm.
you don't necessarily have strong. I got to phrase this precisely. It's not obvious that there's a strong financial incentive to go down that road, partly because I think it's really hard for people to imagine what a world would look like that would be so radically different that people were actually having all like very strong sense of purpose in the world, right? Like because we're so far away from that, I think it's hard to even sort of understand, like, is that a 2x in productivity, or is that like people not being productive, or what does that look like, right? And because of that,
Totally. I
yeah,
think it would be a very different economy as well.
it would be. It would be. What I think is really interesting, though. So, Tony, it sounds like you have some cousins in China. Am I right? Did I pick up on that
Yeah.
correctly? Okay. Um, did you hear about the lying flat movement that happened in China a while ago?
I have, but like it's kind of escaping me what that was.
Yeah.
It sounds very familiar.
Right. So during COVID, right, at the very same time that the US was going through the Great Resignation in China, there was a guy who I think he was 26 years old at the time. He posted on social media and he basically wrote this manifesto of a philosophy of like this idea of just working endlessly in these seemingly dead end jobs that I'm miserable at doesn't make any sense at all. So what I'm instead going to do is I'm effectively going to withdraw from society, work just enough to survive each month. So he had this like really basic minimum income. And then I'm just going to read philosophy books, right? Or I'm going to do things that I like, right? I'm just not going to.
Yeah, I think it's really funny if that was the case. Like, oh, I'm gonna do nothing. I'm gonna give up, and I'm gonna read philosophy books, and I'm gonna read like some Nietzsche and like his, or like I don't know, Sartre, Camus, whatever, and their like critique of nihilism, and be like, oh yeah, like this is perfectly what I want to do, and not, everything that they were criticizing.
There potentially is an irony there, and
It's like some irony.
yeah, and I won't pretend that I know what books he actually read, but that post had a lot of followers. Like it resonated with a bunch of people, and therefore it kind of briefly created. Like I don't know that this is truly a movement that's in full swing, but certainly the sentiment kind of took off because, I mean, even relative to I think Western countries, like a lot of Asian countries, including China, I mean, purpose is not like they're not even close to that, right? Like, I mean,
Right.
systemically, if you sort of think about how everything's designed, um, yeah, there's way more kind of control and way less freedom, particularly in this ecology of like how you experience, right, the education system and work. So, yeah, it's interesting. Like, I feel like that the reason I'm bringing this up is there's clearly signs that I don't think existed before of some form of nonviolent rebellion against the system, right? Whether it's Great Resignation, where everybody quit, but then they couldn't figure out what they were going to do, right? So they ended up mostly going back to similar jobs, right, after quitting. Or in China, when some people propose, well, just withdraw from society completely. These are very extreme kind of moves to make.
Mm.
And so it's almost like at least my feeling about this type of stuff is when we see this, it's a cry for help, but it's a cry for help where they just don't know what else to do, right? They're just frustrated about that. And this is at the level of the collective, right? These are things that I don't recall seeing before, right? And so I do think that there's a shift where as much as you and I are talking about, well, this is probably not going to change, or oh, this is it certainly there's an attitude shift, I think, if I think about now, I've done the job of a professor 13 years. I do think that there's definitely been a change since I first started for each incoming
Mm.
class, which is roughly the same age, and the attitude that they bring in and what they value,
Mm.
right? It's nothing
And
I've
you
done,
think,
right? So,
yeah, you think it's like you don't think this has always existed and people are just like more open to talking about it and more connected? Like
um,
this is an honest question. Yeah,
yeah,
like is
yeah,
like you think there's a change?
yeah, I do. I think there's a real shift. Let me see if I can be as precise about it as possible. If I think about my parents' generation, right,
Hmm.
their attitudes about work, it's not that they would necessarily have been happier in their jobs. They just would have just understood and accepted what they had more, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and I've just noticed this progression, since then, particularly if we think about, are they called Gen Zers now? Like people in their 20s, right, that are going through
Hmm.
now. There is far
Hey,
less.
I'm still in my 20s.
Okay, so we'll call
Early
you.
20s.
Yeah, I'm not, so I have to separate myself from this group. But sure, Tony, your group, your category. But but I do notice that there's an attitude shift, right? Where what was okay before just isn't. It's not that that's changed. It's just the tolerance or the acceptance of it, and then there's more questioning, right?
Hmm.
Um, and it's always been there, but the reaction is different, right? In the old days, it just would have been like we would have shrugged and been like, well, that's the way it is. And now it's more like, no, this is not okay, right? And
Right.
um,
Do
and
you think
things,
that's a
yeah.
good thing? Do you
Oh
think that's a
yeah.
good thing?
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, it's like,
Oh, okay, okay.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, so it's really bad for everybody who wants control, right? In the system, right?
Uh-huh.
If you're running a university and you love the way it's been working for the last 100 or 200, I'd even more than that years, you're definitely not liking this, right? You're probably saying Gen Zers are spoiled and entitled, or there's a lot of words that get thrown around sometimes by older folks about this. Much of which I think is actually characterizing more of just a change in the attitude of tolerance for certain types of things that it's not clear should be tolerated, but kind of before I think people didn't think that they had choices. I think now, for whatever reason, there's a shift. The only thing that's dangerous about moments like this, Tony, I think is just like any younger generation that comes through, there's a lot of energy. And it can get focused in all different kinds of directions, right? And so the question is what the dissatisfaction makes total sense, and I think it's correct. It's just a question of, so what is everybody going to do about it, right? And I don't know if you're aware of this. In the US, there's at least 7 million, mostly males between 25 and 45, who have actually checked out from society. So, and because they've checked out, like they don't necessarily have a job or anything, it's actually very hard to track them in government statistics because almost everything is based
Hmm.
on being tracked when you file for taxes, for example, and things like this. When you don't, it's harder to know what you're up to, right? But more
Sure.
recently,
Yeah.
people have kind of done the math, and I've actually realized that there's just kind of gaping hole in the math, and they've poked around a little bit to the extent they can, try to figure out what these mostly males are doing. They're hanging out with their family. They're playing a lot of video games. They're probably not in a lot of relationships, for example. And this is something that we've seen. Sometimes you can watch YouTube videos about this. Like this has happened in Japan for a long time.
Mm.
Um, there's a large population of mostly males in Japan that have this kind of lifestyle. Um, and it seems like that there's a growing number of these men or they're just becoming more visible, and I'm not sure which it is, but that's also partly I think an issue, right, of what's going on here. It is very
Yeah.
much related to purpose. Like these are people who on paper absolutely have the means to go do something and have somehow decided not to.
Mm.
um, and so
Yeah. What do you think about as like a society how we shake this collective, I don't know, nihilism, if you can call it that, and like move, one rung up the ladder?
um, it's a good question. So moments like these, I think, at any point in history, when you have a whole generation that's kind of wanting to throw out the old ideas, they've got a lot of energy because they're young. So it's just about what are we going to do to organize, to sort of have a better collective experience, right? Which is really what this is about. Becomes very susceptible then to whatever the leadership or the influencers of that generation kind of say, right? And what I'm seeing, if I kind of put a generational divide between you and I and Tony, right? For like Gen Zers, you guys are following a variety of different folks on a spectrum, some of which I would call quite destructive and unhealthy, right? Depending on who we're talking about. And on another end, potentially very, very encouraging. I think the level of social consciousness, I mean, Tony, you're actually an example of this, I think, right? Oh, the way you didn't tell me your path is that okay, I did 4 years at McKinsey. I'm doing this Wharton gig. I'm going to go off and work in giant private equity firm, I'm going to make it up to partner and I'm just going to cash out, right? I'm going to go hang out.
I thought about it.
So for sure you would have thought about it, right? Because it's absolutely one of the natural paths that you could have taken. And for you to not take that path is costly monetarily, right? Unless you're telling me that you're going to go make the same money at, doing what you're about to, but I do not think
No.
so. Policy does not pay the same as private equity, right? Or hedge funds or whatever it is. Like it's always been this way. So for you to make that conscious choice, and you're not the only one, um, and to do that in a way that this is sort of clear for your mind, knowing that nothing in your undergrad business education and maybe at Wharton, but I'm going to say I'm not even sure about that, would have pushed you in these directions necessarily, means that you somehow got the gumption to do it on your own, right? Or maybe talking to your friends who felt similarly, right? And so you didn't think it was such a hard thing to go do. And I think that's super encouraging. I'm not exactly sure why that's happening. I could argue that, I don't know, maybe you guys are just more socially conscious and willing to kind of live up to it, right? And beyond rhetoric. And so, if that's true, I think that's great. Um, I suspect there's probably more to it than that. So I don't fully understand the reason why, but I do notice just observing that there is a shift, right? And kind of what people like your age would care about and would want to
Mm,
dedicate their lives to. And it's a reflection of a change of values too in the weighting, to be quite honest, right?
hmm.
So there is a dollar amount, obviously, I'm sure that you value, but then like that incremental, whatever fill in the blank number is, just at
Right.
that point was not, that clearly wasn't going to do it for you, and you wouldn't trade that for what you're going after now, right? Tell me if I've got that wrong, by the way.
No, no, yeah.
Okay.
I think yes. Yes, and to circle back to like our earliest point, like sometimes we just don't make these like optimized decisions. We're just making gut or by feel decisions too. But as long as you're making them versus giving up on trying to make them, I think that's the like social consciousness or
Uh,
consciousness.
okay. I love that you brought this point up. Tony, I want to ask you the following. You're in a place where, you've taken this path and you're clearly conveying that you've got a pretty clear sense of what you want to do next, at least, right? And
Hmm.
you're in that choice, you're also conveying a set of values, right, that are coming through, right? And I know that you've clearly made some choices about your values because you're trading some things clearly by doing what you're telling me,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
There's another person, let's call him Tony also out there. There's another Tony who's also
Okay.
29, who's got a very similar resume to yours, who is miserable, right? Like
Okay.
he's not happy doing the things he's doing. Um, and he's not choosing choices that would necessarily make him happier, right? And we can debate about, why this other Tony exists in the world, why that's a thing, but that is a thing, and I see it with some regularity. Why do you think that you're this way and the alternate Tony is the way that he is? Like, because actually, you guys were probably classmates, right? Potentially.
Yeah. I um I think I think any answer that I give might be an overfit, but I think partially for me at least our resumes might look the same, but like sometimes I think these, at least for me, these like changes in mindset and attitude live both in like the like smaller day-to-day moments as well as that kind of define an arc in your life of like how you perceive how you're doing, as well as just like big personal things that like I very much think about. So I think like earlier on in this conversation, I alluded to like some personal things that occurred. And essentially it's like in university, in second year, our family just went through like a tremendous loss when my dad passed away very suddenly, probably within a year of being diagnosed. And I think that over the next 2 years, especially post my banking summer, because there was just like a lot of just like heads down grind leading up to it. Like that fourth year was when I started to kind of like make sense of like what had happened and how I would kind of like respond and choose to respond. And so the like North Star, I hate that term, it's such a consulting term, but like the North Star that like I always go back to thinking about that time is I think maybe best described by like the the Nietzsche book, like The Myth of Sisyphus, where you're kind of like pushing this rock up a hill and it's hard and it's like an allegory to life. And it's like you're whenever you get up this hill and achieve something, it like rolls back down and you're not entirely sure why you're pushing this rock back up the hill. And the very simplified lesson is like what you have to do if you or how you like live and create purpose in a life like that is to like enjoy pushing the rock up the hill and think of pushing it up as like change and progress and like a movement forward. And I think that that is like how I've come to deal with like situations that I find kind of like senseless. Like my dad, very, very young, kind of passing away. And also, like, this might be a romanticization, but like, I feel like it's also kind of like how my dad wanted to live life too, where like he is incredibly capable and competent, and just like some things in life just did not work out for him, like at many different turns. Whenever he was taking a step forward, it felt like there was also a step back. And so I don't, I've never talked to my dad about this. So it's not like I can confirm whether this is like his worldview or not. But at least from like an idealist romantic standpoint, it's what I've like chosen to believe. And so, this other Tony might have this like same resume, but like I think for me, even when things are like going really wrong, I like try to still make decisions to go forward. And there's a lot of people I think that are very instrumental on a day-to-day basis too, which includes Brandon, who's like one of my best friends. Um, and I don't know if anyone else asked me to do this, like if I would, if I'm being honest, because it's like it's um a little out there, but like it's the kind of thing where he has definitely at points in my life been pushing like my boulder up the hill with me. Um and so like this is the kind of thing that like comes from I don't know, like time and space, one, like that I had in fourth year of Ivy and I had at Wharton. And also um and also like and not an education, I guess, but like I guess mine was like more self-driven, but like an education that prioritizes like living a whole life and like creating purpose that I think is like really hard to explain because like even now I think it took me like 10 minutes to explain this like whole thought out loud and I don't know if I did a good job. But like those kinds of things are so intangible and so personal that I don't, that's why I asked you the question. I don't, it's like, it's unreplicable, that kind of thing. And then like how I think about it to be like, this is why I don't feel like stuck, even if I'm like maybe stuck at points in my life.
Okay. So I think I've got part of it, right? What you're describing is basically a philosophy you have, right?
Yeah,
That developed, maybe you already had it prior to kind of what happened with your dad's passing, but it certainly kind of solidified a lot after that. The part that I'm wondering about, and Tony, you did a great job articulating this, is just given everything that you just said, I could still see that a choice path that you could have taken would be, and you know what? I'm still just going to go to private equity, right? And still do this, right?
oh totally,
Because your
totally.
attitude would have still kind of matched that, right? Based on what you've told me.
Yes, totally.
But you didn't, right? Like you still kind of decided you were going to go veer in a different direction and respect a different value set. And so I guess what I'm wondering is like what is the piece that, because in either road it sounds like your philosophy could have taken you that way, but you didn't go the other road.
Sure. Sorry, I think my answer there was responding to this idea of another Tony who feels stuck
Oh, sure.
with like
Okay.
a similar resume. I
Yeah.
think the question about why I didn't, go down the private equity route, or I mean, who knows if I actually would have gotten the job. But like at least the banking route, because I did have like a concrete option in front of me. Um, is like I think one, even in a summer, I could feel like a summer internship, I could feel like longer term, like this as like a career wouldn't not be one that I would like derive, personally at least, like a lot of joy in.
Yeah.
And I think there was a lot of things about the job that I loved mechanically, because I'm like, I don't know, like spreadsheets, numbers, yeah, like all good with me. But like I think it's like you're kind of you're kind of thinking about the world in one specific formula, right? Which is like a very like finance-led, value-driven formula. And I think like that just wasn't what I wanted. Versus like even in consulting, you're like tackling problems in very different ways, depending on the problem. And even for similar problems. At least my my experience of it. And so I think there's that. And I think the like broader framework in my mind is like there are things in contradiction in my mind where um where sometimes I don't know how to resolve the contradiction. And so I just pick one. And as long as I'm okay with it, then I'm okay with it. And I'm not gonna like, and I understand that like I didn't make a perfect decision, but I couldn't have made a perfect decision. And there is another world where I might have had faced the same contradiction and I just picked the other one. And like, I don't think that ultimately, I think my life would be different and like I probably would be a different person. But like I also think I'm a different person than I was like 10 years ago. So like sometimes there's still like a distance. So like I don't think about it too much. Like it's I think like when you're like, oh, you could have done the P route, I'm like, yeah. And I think like I still would have found ways to be like happy and like it. So it's not
It's not so much that. Like it's not
Hmm.
as important whether I did this route or that route, in my mind, at least. It's just that I ended up picking one. And now that I picked it, I'm just gonna go and do it. And I'm gonna keep picking.
Oh, I see. Okay. So
Like I don't think like I would think a lesser of a me that did go and do PE.
I see. D do you think that version of you would be just as happy? Or would you just say, I don't know?
I don't I guess I don't know, but I want to believe so. Because
Okay.
I think like it's one thing to make that decision, but like then there are subsequent decisions and you don't know how those will go. But like knowing me today, like I might have tried going to PE, but like maybe it wouldn't have worked out and then I would have done something else, or maybe it would have, and like I could find a different way to create purpose in that role. But like I think as like a North Star, this is like a level below it. And so generally I'm like, yeah, probably, but who knows? I don't think about it. It's fine.
Interesting. Um, so it took me a while to come to this. How would I describe this? It's a framework. Maybe this is the best, like as a B school guy, I would say it this way, maybe for when I watch people and observe how they make these are big life choices, right? Technically, right? Am I going to go down this road? Am I going to go down the other road? Um, and I find that basically there are, let's say there are three ways that you can try to get some information about, which direction you should go, right? In your case, let's say it's the PE versus the road that you took, but really it's a bigger crossroads than that, right? And really we have multiple ones of these. One is I've seen a lot of students in some matter of personality use the rational part of their brain as much as they can, right? So they will,
Yep.
like, these are the kinds of people that will, like, take a piece of paper and look at option A, write down all the pros and then all the cons, and then almost like a case analysis, right? For HBA, right? If you were going to do this for strategy. Um, there are other people who don't do that. What they will do is they will use their intuition, right? So they will sort of say, "Well, I don't know. I just had a gut feeling that this was the right one," right? But they can't really explain it beyond that, right? It was just kind of that
Hmm.
sign. There's there's another type that will really lean into their emotions, right? And just be like, "Oh, I hated that," or "I just felt like that was, I would shoot myself if I did that one, but I really love this one." Right. And so they're listening to their emotions. Now, in principle, like you could use a weighted average or a combination of all three, right? In practice, what I observe is,
With that.
yeah, there's no one I've ever seen who's like 33%, 33%, 33, 34%, right? It's not like that. People tend to skew very heavily into one of these as a way to make their decision. Okay, so why am I bringing this
Sure.
up? The whole time I've been listening to you, Tony, I have been wondering what it is that you listen to among these
Mm.
three. Um, and my guess is it's not the rationalish kind of person who's like writing all the pros and cons down, all this stuff. Um, Maybe it's the emotional, right? That's probably the one I would bet on. But it actually might, but maybe it's the intuition, right?
I think
Which,
I skew emotion.
okay.
Yeah.
So that
I
ended
think I
up being the
skew
way.
emotion. Yeah, I think my take on it is that like with a lot of these decisions, there's so many things you don't know.
Right.
And and so there's like a limit to how much you can go and analyze. And I think like sometimes it's like a trap because then you feel stuck in a decision because you're like, oh, I've analyzed it. Like this has to be the right way. And you kind of force yourself down a path. And so it's not that I don't do like any like, oh, like compare and contrast or oh, what does my gut tell me? But I definitely skew emotion because I think like yeah,
Yeah,
that's
which makes
yeah,
sense
I thought I had more
actually.
to say, but I didn't. Yeah.
Yeah, no. That answers it for me. I mean, that's kind of where I thought you leaned, but I thought I would just make that explicit, and of course, I had to explain kind of
Yeah, yeah, of course, of
what
course.
the setup was, right? Because what I find, when I have former students that come and talk to me, or even current students about their career issues, sometimes the one that I find is actually the hardest is people who skew real hard on the rational. But to your point, the problem itself doesn't lend itself well to that at all, right? You can write down a list all you want. You actually have no idea what the complete list of pros and cons are. Like you just don't know, right, about these
Yeah.
things. But because they're that type, they'll lean into that so much to add structure to a problem that, quite frankly, can't be solved with structure very easily, right? And as a result, not surprisingly, they often don't get great results, right? And sort of wonder why that's the case, right? But these are kind of interesting things to think about, and we don't talk about them much. And when you're a student, you're so busy just trying to play the game that
Totally.
that
Totally.
you're not questioning the game, right? At that
I
point,
think Ivy in particular, there's a lot of gamesmanship.
it is designed that way. There are good things about that. It achieves many of the goals the school wants. I'm not sure it achieves the goals that maybe should be in the best interest of every student. So,
Yeah.
and
I remember when I was like a student there, I think my average dropped 4 standard deviations after I got my job because I stopped playing the game. It's not like I got like, a lot dumber, but like, well, maybe a little bit, but like, and I still like tried. It's just like I stopped playing. I stopped, strategically putting my hand up and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, it just goes to
yeah,
show how much it matters at that school.
we see it on our side, right? So we can always feel the anxiety in the room to some degree in HBA one,
Yeah.
right? Well, we get it. So I get it. Super sympathetic, and hopefully we can find a better way to do it.